Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are MythVision.
We are MythVision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's your host, Derek Lambert. As usual, I have a special guest today. We're going to get into some very interesting things. And one of those things is Anti-Judaism in the book of Acts. We might rabbit trail into some very interesting stuff from there. But I want to introduce Dr. Jennifer Bird. Welcome to MythVision podcast.
Thanks for having me, Derek. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and you are a PhD in the field. Let me go ahead and give them some of your credentials, a little bio. I thought the bio was very sweet and to the point. It's a little bit beefy, but here we go. Dr. Jennifer Bird relocated to the Portland, Oregon area in 2013 after her 6-year stint as an associate professor of religion at Greensboro College in North Carolina. I don't blame you. She is currently an adjunct, at University of Portland and part-time faculty member for Portland Community College, and she teaches courses in person or online. Go to the website. It's in the description. It's on the screen. Make sure you guys go check her out. For church groups and anyone interested in what she has to offer. In terms of her scholarship, her dissertation was published as Abuse, Power, and Fearful Obedience, Reconsidering 1 Peter's Command to Wives, a look at the material and rhetorical effects of this passage. Permission Granted, which is her book, Take the Bible into Your Own Hands, came out of teaching dozens of introductory courses to both testaments of the Christian Bible, inviting people to stop and wrestle with what is actually being said. Interesting. Instead of what most of us have been told that it says, and she is working on her third book, Marriage in the Bible. I do not think it means what you think it means. I like that title. This will be a deeper look at the basic content she offers in the video series. Just out, Marriage in the Bible, a discussion among friends. For people wanting to talk about marriage, equality, or whether or not it is biblical to affirm same-sex marriage, starting with what the Bible does and does not say, is what she wants to walk you through first. Her education: she earned a bachelor's in mathematics with an education minor from Virginia Tech in 1994, an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary in 2001, and a PhD in New Testament and Early Christianity from Vanderbilt University 2007. Teaching has always been a passion of hers, especially when it comes to communicating academically rigorous content, which I totally understand, to a general audience. This guy right here. Getting to have a hand in people's aha moments is priceless. And I have those aha moments with people like you all the time. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for reading that and for such a lovely way of reading that. I appreciate that.
Well, it's passion because that's what we do. We love what we're doing here. And
right.
I guess let's jump off on what got you into this, I think.
Sure. Wow. Yeah, let's do that. I did come from a Christian family. Is that what you mean? Like my whole, how did I get into what I'm doing? Just a quick
It's subjective. It's subjective. It's
okay.
You and what makes you passionate about this. So,
honestly, to cut to the chase on that, I do. I come from a Christian family, Christian background, United Methodist, if you're interested. And I think what really got me here is the kind of the thing that got me into higher ed in biblical studies was the issue of women and the scriptures, what they say, how people find ways to accommodate them. I have some interesting stories, from my dating someone in college that at one point I asked my mom to take me to go get essentially a new wardrobe, not full, but a few significant pieces of my wardrobe that were much baggier so I wouldn't cause my boyfriend to stumble, those kinds of things.
Yes.
I imagine you are familiar with.
Well, I stumble all the time. I mean, I'm just kidding,
right.
But seriously.
Right, no, but
I know.
Yeah. And one of the things that shows up actually in the introduction of my book is this moment when my mother was being ordained, right? Big day for a person, huge day in her life, right? And she and I have a 5-hour drive home together. And I, in my very conservative, evangelical state, turned to my mother and said very earnestly and honestly, I don't understand how you can get ordained because it's against God's will for women to be ordained.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was basing that, on 1 Timothy 2, right? I do not permit a woman to teach her, So those kinds of moments, and yet I had these really important, strong women in my life as my role models, my family members. And so those kinds of things really came to a head at right after college, when I was doing I was a staff member with Young Life, an evangelical organization, and had this kind of surreal moment of someone showing me the Martha Mary passage through a new lens. And I had this if you can read this really important passage that Jesus spoke, supposedly, right, you can interpret that differently, that in a way that frees me up as compared to, something that different. It was a major shift. What else is there? What else am I missing? So that was kind of got the ball rolling, and I ended up a few years later at seminary. And, the more you dive into these things, as you well know, right, as you're being a student of these things yourself, right, the more you learn, the more it's oh my gosh, first of all, I wish more people knew this, right? I wish more people had access to this information in a way that wasn't threatening, right? Because I had people pull me aside before I went to seminary and begged me not to go. They were afraid I was going to think my way out of my faith, right?
Yeah, that's typical. And that's
Right?
why a lot of people, they are afraid of apologetics even too. It's you start getting into some treacherous grounds when you have a fundamentalist approach to your apologetics. You're going to run into a brick wall. I mean, at some point, something has to happen. So I'm with you. Yeah. So the women issue is a huge one. I mean, obviously I see Facebook posts by Christians, mind you, it was 6-7 years ago. I haven't come out and just went on my personal profile hey guys, this is what I think now. Yeah. I'd lose a lot of friends that way, which I couldn't care less, but because I don't really socialize with them anyway. But they post things, and I see them, and it's always a picture of this teaching woman, and it's not a positive post what they're trying to do. That makes sense.
Yeah, they're not saying go, way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, it's saying shut up, woman. It's pretty much what they're trying to say. You have no authority. Who are you?
Right.
Yeah. So I get you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure you do. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So that was, those moments of, the aha moments for me were pretty significant. And I know how much it was difficult, right, to kind of sort through some of it, but worth it,
Yes, ma'am. So let me ask you this about this, your book that you published.
Yeah.
Is this in the vein of particularly dealing with the women issue? And
no, it's actually, I mean, there are a couple chapters. It's very clear, obvious. You can't, yes. And then it's not. So
right.
A lot of students, for instance, who take my intro classes are I didn't sign up for a feminist class. I signed up for intro. I'm well, we could talk about that. Why is it that you assume just because I'm bringing up a woman's perspective to every single passage, why does that strike you as feminism? Whereas it's only because you've only been given the male perspective on every single passage your whole life. So I'm not doing a feminist, I'm just doing an intro. So every single topic that I do address in Permission Granted, I am addressing from my particular perspective, which raises questions that tend to involve the other and females and, and so, and slaves and things like that. But it's more of a general, excuse me, 12 chapters seemed appropriate. Right.
Does.
Yeah. And then just some of the biggest, it's essentially what are the most interesting conversations to have with students about what's actually going on in the story and the most transformative then, so the fact that there are two creation stories and really sitting with that and really kind of, a different take, a dramatically different take on Genesis 3, for instance, and talking about the fact that there's violence from cover to cover, and talking about the fact it's not just the Hebrew Bible, but it's also in the Newer Testament.
Yes.
All of these pieces that are one of my favorite is the cover-ups and edited stories. So, what's the story of Samson that every child who goes to Sunday school is taught, right? Why do we feel like we need to teach children about Samson when he's, you know what I mean? He has anger issues. He's probably bipolar. And that's, I'm not judging that, but he probably is the way he's described, right? He's freak of nature, like massively strong, and he's awful in relationships. How many different women does he, right, patronize, calls a cow, like it's only because the women nag him that he gives in. Like, these are not good examples for children.
Right.
I feel like we need to teach him because Samson's in there, and like, what's the take home? I mean, that is one of the most shocking stories, I think, for people who grew up in a church kind of more passively engaged, to actually read and realize he has, like, it's a terrorist suicide event.
And then Delilah, like, you start getting into these interesting, what's going on here? Yeah, there's so much. I also think there's an astral or a celestial aspect to the Samson narrative, where his 7 locked hair, he's the sun figure. There's that probably is playing behind. You got to kind of read behind the lines to see where his hair gets cut off. The 7 locks is the 7 days of the week. The light is being cut off. They gouge his eyes out for the reason of winter solstice, possibly. He's going down and sunlight is dimming. There's an interesting perspective to consider, that not saying that that's the story itself, but behind the narrative, it may have a heavenly body picture, in my opinion. And so there's the human aspect, which they, in my opinion, they anthropomorphize their science of the world, if you will, and the cosmos and whatnot, into their own relevant situation, if you will. So I think that Samson might be a sun figure. His name means the little sun, or something like the sun, I think, is the name of Samson.
Okay. Maybe in a I'm not sure which language. I'm not Hebrew. It's not familiar. Yeah. Shamash is sun, but anyway, Samson. I should look into that.
I don't know that it's not. It means the sun. It means little sun or something like that. So I don't know. I don't know.
To challenge you. I'm just, I'm not familiar.
But so I guess if you don't mind, we can go to Acts.
We can do whatever you want to. I'm here to chat with you, Derek. I'm
awesome.
happy to have this conversation. So.
Well, I'm happy to have you here, because when you said anti-Judaism, I thought to myself, well, I definitely see that happen in the early church. Like, we can't deny it. And is that just a later thing, or are you guys blaming the early church when they're actually looking at texts that are also saying things that give off the impression that we're moving out of Judaism and Israel as a nation to something of another nation, so to speak?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I think you would love Denise Kimber-Buell's book, Why This New Nation? Why This New People?
Yeah.
Yes. Short answer. If we are only blaming the early church, we're missing most of the picture, which is, it's not just the book of Acts, it's not just that and Hebrews, it's
Matthew.
Yes, exactly. We see it in the second gospel, like, chronologically speaking. We see it heavily in John's gospel.
Yeah.
So when you see the later writings reflecting a subtle or less subtle move in that direction, it's definitely in the Gospel of Luke as well. Like, when you see that, I see that as kind of like we were discussing before recording. Like, these are just kind of the logical conclusions of what was started, that perhaps Paul meant well when he brought Gentiles in through a different door than the Jews get in through the covenant, right? Jews get in by keeping the law. Gentiles get into the covenant this other way, and he probably meant well, but he didn't realize the flip side of that was going to be all the antagonism, within that covenant space, and the human part of it all, right? The humans' defense of themselves and their traditions versus, I don't want to cut off the end of my penis, so all those things going on. And so that starts this kind of infighting within Judaism, right? That we absolutely see played out in the Gospels in increasing amounts, that then leads into First Peter and Hebrews, and Acts is shocking. Like, I haven't taught the book of Acts in an intro in at least a decade. I can't go there. It's too much.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess this is heavier material.
It is. Are you okay with that?
Yes, I am. I think for our audience sake, there's some like me who are just going to know where you're going with this, and like understand replacement theology concepts, like kind of getting the gist that something really is radically changing. What is if you would like kind of give a brief synopsis of what is going on in the New Testament, because there are groups that want to try and make it the whole New Testament, and you'd be shocked to find out, but I'm sure there are some groups that are fundamentalist type, and they say the whole New Testament is super Jewish. It's all Jewish to the core, and really? And then there are others who go so far, they throw out everything that even seems Jewish, and they say, no, it's not at all. But is there a progressive revelation, let me not use that phrase because that's used in fundamental circles, a progressive evolution of a change even happening in the documents of the New Testament?
Yeah, I think so. Simple answer. I do think so.
What does that mean, I guess?
A little more complexly, right?
Yeah.
First of all, I do want to, I love the fact that you made the comment about the whole New Testament is Jewish. Just a little caveat. I like to call it the Newer Testament instead. I find that a little more respectful of Judaism.
Okay.
To acknowledge that when you call it Old Testament and New Testament, you are using a Christian label for them both, and all of the supersessionism, right? That this particular segment of Judaism became separate, became Christianity, but claimed that it trumps everything from original Judaism. Or the general field of Judaism in the first century. So if I don't want to throw anyone by my language.
Absolutely. And I have a lot of Jewish friends who do watch this, and they're going to respect that about you already, I can tell you. But I try to tiptoe, but then I get used to talking to other scholars who aren't Jewish, and then I get used to just using Old Testament to be easy because it's what I was raised to think. But I think that everybody knows I don't mean it disrespectful, but yes, I agree with you.
Yeah, and when it's a deeply rooted terminology for you, right? It's hard to shift. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So what were we saying?
So
right.
Yeah.
So
what's going on in it?
I do think, briefly, I do think that all of the Newer Testament should be seen as Jewish material.
Yes.
But I don't know that I am necessarily going to stand on a thing and say it's all, purely Jewish. What I mean by that is all of the writings are written as if the person is standing within the tradition of Judaism.
Right.
Right. And I think that feels a little different to me than to say it's all Jewish, because it's being written at a time when there is a fight within Judaism about what true Judaism looks like. And that's why there's a group called Pharisees that sprung up 200 BCE or so, wanting more purity, wanting more connection to the Torah and keeping to the rules. Like there are divisions within Judaism about what it really truly should be or look like, which isn't unique to anyone, right? That's what happens with traditions, right? What's the true trajectory, right? So that when we get to these writings that become labeled Christian, they are still wrestling within a Jewish framework, I think. And I think that's really shocking to a lot of people to even try to comprehend, right?
Right.
So I do have one of my little YouTube clips is, the whole New Testament, all New Testament writings are Jewish. And so, it's something to think about. It might shift the way you frame, the way you come at the writings, right? The scriptures, if you think about it that way. I mean, for some people, just saying that Jesus is Jewish is shocking. So, people are all on a whole spectrum here. I get that, right?
Right.
So like a brief overview then of the Newer Testament writings on this, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, because you bring up an interesting point here. There's division. And most of the critical scholars that I look at, like such as yourself, Dr. Christine Hayes, Dr. Paula Fredrickson, they're, newer perspectives on Paul type stuff. They want to place Paul in a more Jewish framework, respectably.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
This is important. I do have my little questions I have. I just want to put this out there for my audience to see where my brain is when I'm thinking this.
Great,
I don't know what to do with it, but it seems very strange that at the core, and whether this is just Pauline theology that somehow overrides the Jewishness situation of these guys, is that you have a man dying for your sins. Now, what that means is there Christology that kind of gets imported or something that overrides, because I don't know if a truly let me put it like this, is Hellenistic to the core is the best thing I could say.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, because a guy dying for your sins is an abomination that God would take a sacrifice of a human. You know what I mean?
It's not a Jewish concept.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wonder what's going on there. But anyway, I respect your work, their work, and I'm saying, okay, what's going on? Because I have another friend, James Stevens Valiant. He wrote a book called Creating Christ. He thinks that there's more Roman influence, but regardless, he suggests that there's an evolution from what seems to be very Jewish only, Matthew, I only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to let's bring these Gentiles in, and the movement in right before your eyes in the Newer Testament documents evolves. And next thing you know, it's like, you don't have to be a Jew really anymore. It's like, whoa, what's going on now? There's advantages to it, but you don't have to be it. And then, of course, the church goes all the way and says, you crucified our Lord, and now you got anti-Semitism. What's going on in terms of the book of Acts that's changing from Judaism that you're talking about here? Your audio is off a little. I don't know what's going on.
Is it?
There you go. You're back.
Okay. I'm not sure yeah.
I'm sorry. But yes, interesting stuff. I love the way you phrased it though. So
thanks. Well, you touched on so many like juicy topics in that little summary and the way you're looking at it. And so, gosh, can I back up before we're going into
whatever you
just because I think honestly, I respect it a great deal. First of all, that's what you're seeing and you're reading other people and considering their thoughts. But I think it's a very important thing to consider that because Paul was talking to Gentiles, the way he took the execution of a Jewish man and the belief in the resurrection of that man, right? The way he took that event and interpreted it was for Gentiles.
Ooh.
So of course, of course it's Greek and Roman, right? Those are the frameworks that he draws upon. I mean, if you look at the goddess Isis, if you look at, all these different Dionysus, if you look at, I'm drawing a blank on one of the really important ones right now, Mithras,
I love this.
Right. If you look at all of that language, that's what Paul is drawing on in his letters when he's talking to people about making sense of this thing. It's, if you go down, and there's a couple different ways to look at it, right? I'll have to come back later. I can recommend a couple books actually that just address this specifically.
Feel free.
We think that Paul spent a couple years in Ephesus at least. It's hard to know, historically speaking, how true Acts is on that. But if we can trust it generally, and if you go look at the context of Ephesus in the first century, right? There were 6 cities on that spot, or 6 Ephesuses that kind of moved around a little bit with the changing of the tide, but or the changing of the coast. But if you look at Ephesus when Paul was around, I mean, they've done a lot of archaeology on it. It's really exciting to go see. But the primary goddess of the city is Artemis, right? A female. The second most important god in the city is the goddess Isis. She has a temple in the Bouleuterion, in the political part of the town. A temple to a goddess, female. Hello.
Hint, hint.
Right? I mean, and so these gods and goddesses are important, and their followers are. That language is being used to talk about the death, the resurrection, what the community looks like, the things they're committed to. Absolutely. You could also look at it through the concept of the models of salvation that Paul employs in his letters, which is I think quite fruitful, but it's also really hard, I think, for Christians to, or for people who are familiar with this concept that Jesus died for our sins, to see that in any way besides whatever nebulous that thing is that they believe when they say that. Because you can't get someone to pin down what that actually means, by the way. Jesus died for my sins. What is that? What equation is that fulfilling?
Right.
But if you look at those models of salvation, all but one are Greek or Roman. They're not Jewish. So spot on that.
So that's a Hellenistic import that I think is interesting, because I thought to myself, the pillars, right? Peter, James, the Petrine, this, there's no way. I just couldn't wrap my head around. There's no way these guys, unless there's such a fringe group that I'm not aware of that somehow found their way out there. And it's possible. I'm not going to say it's not, but to me, I just couldn't wrap my head around them believing in this human sacrifice for their sins. it would have been naturally an abomination for any Torah observant Jew, which even today it is. And so I'm with you 100%. That makes perfect sense. The import of Pauline theology, or at least let's just say, even if it wasn't Pauline, let's say he isn't the original, which let's just say the evidence we have, he may be, but there were previous churches that exist. My question would be, do you think we getting nitty gritty here. Why is Paul going to synagogues? Okay. Talk to me here. You already know where I'm going with this. What's going on?
Great. It's great. It's a great question. One thing, there's a book, oh shoot, again, I'll come back with it, but
no problem.
John Dominic Crossan collaborated, and I'm sorry I don't have these names on the tip of my tongue right now, In Search of Paul, and it's a very long subtitle. And their premise is that Paul in his own letters makes no reference to talking with Jews, right? He goes straight in and he makes this new thing, right? He's talking to Gentiles. It's all about the Gentiles, bringing them into the covenant. And the book of Acts suggests that he always goes straight to the synagogue and talks to Jews, and it's not until he fights with them and they throw him out that he then goes to the Gentiles. This book, the John Dominic Crossan and whoever, sorry dude, suggests that when he goes to the synagogues, he's actually only interacting with the God-fearers. Are you familiar with that label?
Yes.
I don't know if all of your listeners are. God-fearers would be Gentiles who want to be a part of a synagogue. And so they, they're patrons. They support it financially. They're part of the community, but they would be, considered part, but there's a distinction since they aren't Jewish, right? So their argument is that Paul always went to talk to those folks to try to win them back over into this Gentile space that is now also a part of the covenant. I think there's an interesting thing there to consider. My take is, I think I'm very suspect of the book of Acts, period. And that is because if you start to look at even just those first few chapters, you've got people saying things right out of the gate after Jesus' execution and resurrection, right, that event, right out of the gate, they're saying things that it took close to 90 years to develop in thought. Sorry, you don't get to do that, but you do when you're writing in the year 120 or so, and you're looking back and writing this retrospective historia, which is different than history. So from the get-go, there's a collapse of time or something, right? And so Peter is saying things that there is no way he would be saying. Paul is doing things and saying things that he never talks about in his own letters, in places where it would be really helpful to reference if it had been true.
It's fair to say that they're making Paul look a lot like Peter and Peter look a lot like Paul.
Yeah. Absolutely.
They're making him more, almost like they're balancing them out on purpose because they were total polar opposites in reality.
Or that they at least fought with each other.
Right.
Paul, and I actually don't even think of them as polar opposites so much as having a power, but that's just me, right? Having a power fight. This is a power struggle between the two of them. And because Paul asserts his correctness, his authority over and over and over and over, he does protest too much, right? That's my take. But yes, I think you're absolutely right in that there's this weird flipping of roles. And for me, I don't need Paul to be anything in particular, but I'm really offended on Paul's behalf because he's taken in and shown to be a part of that original group of disciples and apostles. No. That's not, according to Paul, he had nothing, thank you very much, to do with them.
Yeah. You as a woman, I have to say this for our audience, this is so important, guys. That song, This Is a Man's World. Okay. Look, if it weren't for women, all right, the things you guys, girls, catch in these texts that we men go right past and don't realize, there's emotion in these letters that we don't pick up. Oh yeah, he said shut up. Okay. No, you're like, he said shut up. And it's like, what's that mean? And you're like, let me tell you. And so I'm glad that you brought that up because I've been trying to point out how much animosity really goes on in Paul's letters. You got to have a eye for it, though, and you ladies do.
That's interesting. I really appreciate you saying that.
Well, I've also heard from other scholars. They said that the females scholars, thankfully we have them starting to rise on the scene. They can even do it in the Gospels. And I'm like, well, how do they do that? No, you can tell. The women can tell that one gospel writer knows about the other one, and he's purposely doing something different.
Having little cat fights. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Paul is actually after this Marriage in the Bible book, my next book, which is one I've been working on for almost 20 years now, just because I can't finally sit down and write it, but is before reading Paul, read this.
Right.
Because if you're going to go read the letters of Paul, I want you to consider, this list of things so that you'll, essentially what you just said, so that you'll have a heads up. When Paul says X, Y, Z, you might actually have a framework to say, oh, wait a minute. Really? Do I need to trust that just because he said it? And that's that. Anyway, we're getting up on all these fun tangents. I mean, the way that Paul has authority and power, and that scholars and pastors need to agree with Paul in order to have power and authority is just really fascinating to me. And I just want to come in and say, well, what if he doesn't have so much power and authority to begin with? Maybe he's wrong. What if he's wrong at points? What if his best effort to fix a problem worked temporarily, but 2,000 years later, we need to let it go?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, he's coming from a framework that might be just, it's a human. We've got a lot. I tell this to people all the time, if you're going to cherry pick, but that's okay. I'd rather you be a cherry picker than try to really follow this thing to the T, because God forbid we're stoning children again, I'm just joking around with that, but
Parents or something, right?
Yes, ma'am. So Anti-Judaism in Acts. I think we got
there. Okay, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I mean, so kind of what are the highlights here? There are a couple things that people, if you just wanted to go, you could kind of take this and go just kind of read through some of the passages for yourself, but go to the speeches. Before I say any more, I do want to just, for the folks watching this, listening to this, whatever, for your sake, I think it's a really hard thing to consider when this is really sacred writings. These are sacred scriptures for you. These are inspired by God, and I do not, I never want to dismiss a person's belief in that, right? I want to respect that, actually, and invite you into maybe a more complex thinking about it. And so I hope my cats, by the way, are not too distracting.
I don't hear them.
Okay. But many of us are taught to think of what's said in any of Scripture, but in particular the Book of Acts, as actual documentation of what happened, right? And it makes sense, because that's how they read. They read like a narrative of someone who was there, witnessing it, and get it. But when we understand and we look at the way historia would be written, they were more interested in telling the story as it should have happened than in doing any kind of research to find out what actually did. Because, I mean, obviously, think about it. They didn't have data banks the way we do. They didn't have those kinds of resources. Word of mouth is trustworthy until it isn't, right? So histories, and you can look at secular versions to kind of verify, oh, right. Thucydides tells the story of the Peloponnesian War. He's not in the middle of any of those debates or cheerleading sections, pep rallies, or pep talks, or in the battlefield. But he's got all these long speeches. No. He admits he makes that stuff up, right? What's relevant, what would have been said. So when we look at the speeches in Acts, they are pretty long, first of all.
Yeah.
Nobody gets up and makes that kind of a speech. Just, in the middle, about to stone somebody or whatever, right? So go read the speeches and pay attention to what's being said. They start out identifying with whichever group of Jewish men they're talking to. They call them Israelites, they call them brothers, they talk about our ancestors, they gave us these things, and then right when they're about to stick, whatever, it's your ancestors, your people. They shift. And you killed Jesus the Christ. And when you reference that about the Christ killers, it is said in the book of Acts at least a dozen times.
Wow.
Stephen, Peter, and Paul all accuse very assertively Jewish men of killing Jesus. So, that isn't, historically speaking, it's not the Jews that did it. It's very complex. It was political, right?
Right.
So that's one thing. Just pay attention to the language of the speeches, which make up a pretty significant component, and also kind of create the framework or the background for most people, right? They take those as actual fact. And they, Stephen actually said on his dying breath, just like Jesus did in Luke, in his dying breath, Father, forgive them. And you know what they do. And Stephen says basically the same thing. Like, really? Yeah. Show me somebody who's dying of suffocation on a cross.
Wow. Yeah. Like he has all this energy to say these things. Anyway,
Presence of mind too.
That's interesting. I like how you said that they paint it how they think it should have gone.
Exactly.
That's one way of saying, as some scholars do, not all agree, that they're painting over purposefully what they wish would have taken place, but also laying out like, look, we can't have animosity, down the road.
That's
so
right.
We got to make sure that everyone knows that we're all one mind, one spirit.
Yes. No, that's really powerful, Derek. Honestly, I mean, the kind of the passing the baton, right? Jesus to Peter, the rock upon which I'm going to build this thing, right? Peter's the one standing up and making these really grandiose speeches, and he's powerful, and people believe just from his speeches. And then, and then the stoning, and then, right after Pentecost, and then you have the stoning of Stephen and these people. And so there's this passing the baton. And yes, Paul is kind of baptized into this perspective, this group. And yes, it does pass on to him for the second half of the book. Yeah, or more than half, but.
So the anti-Judaism, is there any jabs in particular in Acts that take us away from Judaism, if you will, trying to?
Okay, so saying that Jews are the ones who killed Jesus, who is the leader or the one worshipped in this segment of Judaism, it's such a great, incisive question, because even within the book of Acts, we don't yet have a clear embracing of a different label called Christian. The label comes up twice. It's like an offhanded reference to, oh yeah, and that's the community that was first called Christians, and then I can't remember the other references. So it isn't that we're trying to define Christians, it's that we're trying to define this segment as correct, the true tradition. But every single time, like there's this, once you get to the we are us, and now it's us and them, or sorry, it starts at we, all of us together, and then it goes to us and you. There's always the label of Jews, Judaioi, is used in that sense to try to claim that Jews are different from us believer Jewish types over here or something, So it's that's where that book that I referenced, Denise Kimmer-Beale's book, Why This New Race, and that's why this new. Anyway, so getting away from Judaism specifically, there are lots of the part of the problem is it's a lot of building blocks. It's a lot of saying that the Jews don't understand their own scriptures, but saying it many times, right? I mean, if you think back to your more fundamentalist thinking, I don't know if that was a thing that you maybe thought and believed, that Jews just really didn't understand their own scripture. They weren't reading it right.
I couldn't wrap my head around how they couldn't see, as a Christian, how they couldn't see that this was Jesus, right?
Yeah,
I mean, because you can see the way that you're taught to view it, Jesus in the Old Testament, the way, but then again, now I'm looking at it as the way I think now, and I'm going, well, if you gave me a book, I could probably write a heck of a story utilizing things that are in a book, incorporating concepts, verses, etc., into a book, possibly. I'm not trying to take away the magic of it. I just think I couldn't understand why you couldn't accept this.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And what's interesting, I think, about that is they are cherry picking, right? They are also, when they're writing the book of Acts, when they're writing the Gospels, Matthew, who quotes it how many times? At least 28 direct, this happened in order to fulfill what was spoken, that he's pulling those out of context, right? So there's also a tradition to do that, right? The way that I used to be really good at this. I knew, like, I was familiar with so much of scripture that when you talked about a tent here, I would connect it to 5 other passages that reference tents, and they must all have meaning together.
Yes.
Does that sound familiar?
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what some of the Jews were doing in the first century, BCE, CE, like they were doing that. And so, and it's not like someone was coming on and saying, stop quoting out of context, that's disrespectful. Nobody was saying that was wrong. It was one of the ways you did things. And so that when we read Matthew saying this happened to add meaning to what happened back here,
Mm-hmm.
we're thinking of it more as that was predicting this moment. So we're taught to misunderstand the prophets themselves, and then that leads to all these other ways that now we have this shift to see everything is talking about Jesus.
Yes.
Instead of reading them themselves for what they're addressing at that point in time.
There's a saying Christians have: the Old Testament is the New Testament. This is how they say it.
Oh, yes.
The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And, I used to think the magic was in there. But, the interpretive weight is looking at it through the New Testament, which then I could see why Jews who are looking at their book and saying, no, nice try. Well, not with my interpretive method, so I'm going with the end game, and the end game is what I think is true telling you of the beginning. Yep. And they're going, dude, you don't understand.
Yeah.
That's not what we believe. That's not what it taught. And I had Rabbi Tovia Singer, he's an Orthodox Jew, come on my channel a couple times already. He points out some interesting funnies, if you will, that Paul does. He misquotes, he misquotes some stuff too, but he says he purposely uses text for only his own means. So like 1 Corinthians 9, he talks about how there's a law that says don't muzzle an ox. And he says, but does God really care about oxen? No, he's talking about us. And it was like, I thought ancient Israel was worried about their oxen, I just don't even know what to do with it. You know what I mean?
No, I love that. I was like, do you know what any of the others are? But that's, yeah.
He goes to Hebrews. I'll find out from him.
Oh, Hebrews is full of it because it quotes so many times from the Hebrew Bible scriptures. Yeah. And and then it twists it. And, it gets me either angry or, cracks me up. It depends on the mood I'm in, the space I'm in, whether I'm angry about it or just like, can you believe? But
I take delight in finding out that, because it takes away the abracadabra that I used to have about it, where I see that these are humans, that they're doing it for their own means. I used to think all of it was magic, and when I use magic, I mean, it was supernatural in that sense.
Yes, that God was ordaining and kind of orchestrating all of this even back then.
Yes.
Like talking about in the creation story, when God in chapter 1 says, now let us, and that Christians many times think that's the Trinity, right?
Yeah.
Sound familiar? I have a really hard time getting some people to consider that maybe that's not the case, and maybe that's actually disrespectful. To read an idea that's 2,000 years later back into the. But you're right, it's magic. It's God's hand at work is how I used to make sense of that.
I absolutely love you. You are awesome. Seriously, I really want to do more shows with you, and we can go into all sorts of topics. Okay. If you would entertain with Acts and Matthew, a question on Matthew, because you heard me at the beginning say replacement theology.
Yeah.
I listened to a scholar. I can't remember his name. We're not in the memory game very well.
That's right. My brain is not working so well today.
I know there's a man who says something like this. Or hold on, what isn't there a Bible verse that says, no, Paul, I once knew a man who went to the third heaven. I once knew a man who gave a lecture on this. It wasn't me though. This is some other guy. He was talking about Matthew and how it takes these little jabs, like these little obvious, you got to know what you're looking at. Replacement theology things like there will be people from the East and the West that will come sit at the table with Abraham, and it won't be the sons of Abraham. It won't be like the descendants of Abraham, so to speak. They're going to be people who are coming in, like Jesus kind of pokes at. And one person after the lecture, I found the lecture to be fascinating. He said, there's so much more I can't go into that's in Matthew that you need to read this book, that book. They always have books. And the guy said, well, you know, you only gave a few examples, but you could understand that like this. He goes, that would be the case if I didn't have over and over and over examples in Matthew. To me, that gives a dating on a text as well, because there'd be no way pre-temple's destruction, in my opinion, where the economy and the situation, the environment, that you would have a replacement theology when the Romans had not conquered the Jews. Why would you say you're giving this to a new people? So it plays a part in the War of 70. And would you like to comment on that?
Well, I do think that not specifically. Well, I was trying to track with you because I hadn't heard the specific label of replacement theology, but now I think I understand what you're referring to. You know, yes, what you've referred to in terms of the ideas, I can't really add anything. I'm just tracking, and I agree with what you've just said. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you and me would be on the same page. There's probably an earlier form of Matthew. I'm just saying, like, down the road, there were editors probably that added in some redactions or interpolated maybe possibly these concepts. I don't know.
Well, you know, maybe kind of a different angle on what you're talking about. I don't know, I'm assuming, but you know, that you think of, you know, Mark having been written first, and then Matthew, and then Luke, and then John. And that Mark is sometime kind of immediately prior to or during that war with Rome, right? And that when you consider that, it makes sense of the hurried nature, the hurried tone of how many times does they use the word immediately? Euthus, immediately, like they're in a hurry to get to the store, like where we're headed here. It's obviously the shortest, it's the least well, you know, massaged. But it is the heaviest in the apocalyptic element, meaning this could be that moment that God is going to visit us and get Rome off our effing backs.
Yep.
And establish us as our own state. Finally, it's been 2,000 freaking years. It's finally going to happen, right? It's now. Let's get to Jerusalem, make this thing happen, right? The urgency of, and you have that passage in Mark that's very intensely apocalyptic. The apocalyptic element recedes with each gospel to the point where John is anti-apocalyptic, like it's not even on the radar, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, in terms of the temple destruction, they speak of it differently in Matthew and Luke than in Mark, right? It is spoken of differently, and you can have him predicting things that he couldn't predict, you know, beforehand. Anyway,
I wonder if I'm going to get you to cuss one time on the show.
Oh, I'm trying not to. I would have let you F-bombs by now.
You're welcome to be. Well, damn it, it's time to go ahead and start. No, I think
because I don't know you. You know,
You're cool. No, you're cool. I can already tell you're absolutely awesome. If I lived near you, I would interview you in person, and we'd have the high definition, the whole nine. But we got to do what we got to do right now. So, I'm so interested in more of what you're bringing here, because let me ask you this. I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Christine Hayes and Dr. Paula Fredrickson, I suspect.
Oh, Fredrickson. I'm actually not familiar with, I know Chris Hayes, but he's a Hebrew Bible scholar. I don't know Christine Hayes' work. So.
Okay. Paula Fredrickson, let's go with Dr. Fredrickson because they're similar in many ways. Okay. And I think that Dr. Hayes relies on Fredrickson's work a little on the New Testament because she's the scholar in that kind of stuff. What do you have do you have any things in common, or do you guys pretty much agree with her, or are there things different? Because does she agree with you? Because it sounds like when I listen to her lectures, and I haven't listened to enough, and I haven't read her books that I have right now on Audible. I got to read them. I can't really comment, but it sounds like she's trying to make Paul be a really good Jew who's trying to do the right thing. And I'm not saying he wasn't a Jew and he couldn't possibly be doing that. I know some people who think he was a real Greek and not even a biological descendant of Abraham because of this. I'm like, I don't know where they get that, but they just think he's too far for him to be a real Jew, practicing Jew. And then Acts, of course, paints this vivid Gamaliel, like, come on, man.
I will come back to your specific question, but the scholar whose work I used for this 6-week course on the Anti-Judaism and Acts, Shelly Matthews, she has a couple books, and that's one of the things she talks about is there are 5 or 6 significant Greek things associated, Greek or really important, like the Gamaliel thing about Paul. Each of them separately, maybe, but all of them together, no, fucking way that.
Yeah.
Here's one of my things about, I to be honest, haven't read a lot of Paula Fredrickson. I've listened to several of her papers at conferences. I think she's a brilliant woman, and she's an incredible scholar. And when I've heard her papers presented, my response to her is similar to my response to a lot of scholars, and that is, there's a really important nugget in here that would explode things if you could say it more passionately. There's a lot of work on emotion in making a change, right? We are more emotional than we are rational, even though many of us, I'm assuming the two of us here, like to think of ourselves as very rational, but we are emotional beings. So I think I probably would agree with everything Paula has said, and I would defer to her because she's in an area of expertise that I just don't spend a lot of time in. And I think the idea of reading Paul through a Jewish lens, I think, is very productive. So I respect that. Pamela Eisenbaum does something similar, actually. She talks about the book that I'm thinking of is Paul Was Not a Christian. And there's a great subtitle to it. And she is a Jewish woman also doing Newer Testament studies at Iliff. Anyway, so that's, I can't get into specifics, unfortunately, about Fredrickson, but I do respect her very much, and would consider that I have something to learn from her. Not so, you know what I'm saying? So
right.
I would take a critical lens, but I still am thinking she's pointing out things because she's steeped in that worldview that I can learn from. So
absolutely, you bring up an interesting point about Paul. If we're looking at Paul as a Jew through the Jewish lens, this is where it gets really, the rubber hits the road for me. And this goes back to these nugget drops that we were talking about. What the heck is a truly Jewish man trying to be faithful Jew? And she believes apocalyptic Jew.
Yes.
So, and I don't blame her. I mean, Paul's obviously apocalyptic. He's trying to fulfill God's promise or to make it happen. Almost like I'm gonna play a little funny politics. We've had some pretty hardcore right-wing fundamentalist presidents over time that have tried to make prophecy be fulfilled in the Middle East. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. Paul seems to be doing that on behalf of the Jewish people, trying to, it seems, fulfill or make the Gentiles receive the light somehow. But his message is what I have a problem with. And how can a truly Jewish man, in Paula Fredrickson's sense, have a man die for the children of Israel? It appears he dies for Israel. And then in some places it appears he's universal, like Paul in Acts 17, clearly from one man, all the nations, and from all men everywhere to repent. And then you got Matthew that says only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or he came to save his people from their sins. And this is a exclusive elect group. So you have once again another rift in the New Testament of exclusivity, limited, very particulars, and universal, broad. They can't even get their minds made up. So I know I laid a lot on you there, didn't I?
You did, but I love it because, what I always try to do with students, or because I don't know how much we can address in just this brief conversation, but what I try to lay out for people is to the best of our understanding, let's posit this guy Jesus from Nazareth, okay? And let's posit that what is spoken about him and the things he said are true to a guy at that point in time who's a Jew, who's fed up to here with not having the promises fulfilled, and with, by the way, a very recent change in the taxation system that is fleecing us even more. And so I'm pissed, and I'm drawing on Amos, and I'm drawing on all of these prophets who've gone to those in charge and said, get your shit together, because the way you're treating us is breaking the covenant. Do you see that? Right? This is not true Judaism. The way you're behaving is not it. Get it together, or Rome's going to come in, and blah, blah, blah. And so if we read Jesus's story, the narrative the thing that gets him killed is standing up for Israel, right? Standing up for that true, keeping the covenant, worshiping this God. We are taking care of each other. When we have someone fraudulent in power, we denounce them and get them out. That can be seen as dying for Israel. He's right.
Right. Yes. Oh,
and
yeah.
So, that is what gets him killed. Is, well, Rome has moved in and forced the Jews to collect taxes on their behalf. Right around the year 6 Common Era, they literally make that change. They said, well, hey, actually, we've noticed you all have this gathering once a year, and most Jews come to Jerusalem for that whatever gathering. So why don't you just collect taxes for us? Well, no wonder that's the time of year, Passover, that all these rebels start things up, right?
Wow.
More Jews go to Jerusalem. That means more Roman guards, more Roman presence needs to be there to keep the peace, right? So no wonder. It's not like someone like Jesus who's drawing crowds, right? When he's out in the wilderness, when he's out in the rural parts, he goes to a town, and I don't care if it's 50 or 5,000. It doesn't matter. 50 is probably likely, and they call it 5,000 to make a point, right?
Yeah.
In the story, right? But they hear he comes, and they're like, oh yeah, he's the one. What he's saying, that's neat. He's speaking up for me because I'm being fleeced by this system, this taxation system, and I'm having to give it up my land, and then I'm the only one around to work it, and then they're trying to take their part too, and how am I supposed to make those ends meet? He's, that guy going to Jerusalem in the middle of a high holy day week-long festival. Of course he knows he's going to be killed by the end of the week. It's kind of the point, is to get in there and say, stop your shenanigans. No wonder he goes to the temple the first morning of the week, and he says, my father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer, you idiots. You're making it a den of robbers. And I love to point that out, because people are like, oh yeah, they're stealing, they're charging too much. I'm like, no. Think about it. What is a den of robbers? A den of robbers is where you collect your loot. It's where you make your plans. It's where you're safe as a robber.
Mm.
This is your hideout, and it's a holy place.
And it's the temple. Yeah.
It's the temple. And that, standing up for that, is a way of standing up for Israel. So that's what gets him killed, because the Jewish leaders in Rome are absolutely in cahoots. And then you have Paul that takes that out of the political dynamic, and he turns it into a divinity element. And so we go from imitating Jesus's righteous anger to worshiping a God.
Mm.
How else do you get someone who's who's executed by the Romans, who is now someone that the Romans can worship? You do it by removing it from the economic and political sphere and turning it into this other thing, this spiritual reality or something like that.
Right.
So Paul, in all of his best intentions, right? Oh, he shifts the game, right? It's all kinds of. So that, yeah, now we've got, is he dying for us? What does that mean? He's dying for our sins. Well, the sins would be the people that are corrupt, not every single thing you've ever done. That's how Jesus died. Someone who dies for your sins is sin can't handle the love, so sin has to squelch it out, right?
Doesn't it say somewhere about isn't it better for one man to die for the nation than the whole nation to be destroyed, or something like that? It says,
yep, one of the Jewish.
one of the high priest enemies, if you will. Well, he seemed to be prophesying or something. So, but yeah, that does make sense that they took what could have just simply have been a rebel-like figure, Jesus. Not saying he was like a hardcore absolute.
No.
He could have been stoic in nature too, but I don't know. There's so many Jesuses out
There
there.
are so many. And really, it tells you more about the person interpreting him.
Exactly. Yeah, I think if we're going to be fair, no matter what, I'm more convinced that if there was a guy, just my opinion, he was a hardcore, badass who was fighting for his people, and they flipped him. Yeah, they flipped him, and softened up the edges, if you will, and may not have gotten all of it out, but there's hints there in some of the Gospels that seem to let you know. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and so then to your other part of the question, I'm sorry, I kind of.
Please.
Deep there. But then how do we then reconcile that event with what's being said in the Gospels or later? And that's where it becomes this mental gymnastics, right? Paul is the one who gets to tell the story first. You've got the event in 30-ish Common Era. Paul comes along and is writing letters and is going out to the Gentiles for the next 20 years, 25, actually 30, whatever. He's interpreting this event through this lens of bringing in the Gentiles, which is entirely separate from Jesus being angry with his leaders for breaking covenant, right?
Right.
Paul is retelling the story, and that's what Mark and the subsequent gospel writers have to contend with. They have to make sense of the righteous anger of a good Jew that's now been turned into an object of worship. Like, how do you tell that story?
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's why you end up getting such, I think, obviously, just my opinion here, that's why you get such varied perspectives and spins on what it is he died for, or how you make sense of what he died for. And who's your audience? For Matthew's gospel, who's your audience? Most likely other Jews who aren't on board yet with Jesus being the Messiah. So of course you're going to be targeting them and saying, yeah, he came for you idiots. Wake up.
You only, yeah, or even focused on you. Don't even go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. Just
not even a part. Yep.
This is interesting. I love what you just said, and the way that I see it is we've got a you only figure that becomes bigger. Paul's never even met Jesus in real life, so what? I wish we had authentic writings that we know for a fact Peter or James actually wrote that we would know. Yeah. That would, because and even if James wrote James, and let's say interpreters or interpolators added some of the my Lord Jesus Christ, that kind of stuff, because it does have a very Jewish hinge to it, works-based salvation,
Yeah, it's our actions, right?
Yeah,
take care of each other. Yeah.
Interesting.
I know. I have Jewish family through a family member who converted and married in, and I've said to them, I think you all have the right to be really pissed at Paul.
He didn't mean it to happen the way that it did, though. I am with you that I don't think he meant for this to happen.
I don't think so. Yeah. Oh,
no.
Here comes a cat.
That's okay.
I don't think he meant. I'd like to give people the benefit of the doubt that they had good intentions, right? I say that even about First Peter, which is absolutely awful on the elements of. This is Minerva, by the way.
Hey,
got a little cat butt there. Sorry. I think that they're doing the best they could in the moments or whatever, right? I mean, I think it's really fun. Look at the conversion. I think should be put in air quotes of Paul. I think of it more as an epiphany, not a conversion moment. Because if you look at what Paul says in Galatians chapter 1 about his change of heart, it's an epiphany. God was pleased to reveal his son in me. The Greek is in me. Every English translation says to me because of that story on the road to Damascus. But
that to me, this is, I have to poke because you bring make deeper questions become. This sounds like an imported concept that wasn't Jewish necessarily. I mean, it could be, but when Paul says he revealed his son in me, is this stoicism? Is this Platonic thought? Is this Greco-Roman influence? Is it strictly Jewish only? I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's great, right? Because who is his audience? Who is he talking to? What are they going to relate to? I mean, when Paul says, I become all things to all people, I think genuinely that is his most revealing comment of all, right? And that needs to be taken a little more seriously, right?
Yeah.
But, so Paul has this aha moment, and he says he goes off into the desert to work some shit out.
Yeah.
Well, yes, that's what you do when you go to the desert. You go to pray and to think and to get some, right? But that's what he says. I have this thing, and he throws in a really juicy dose of, I was called by God before I was even born. By the way, I'm that important, right? Not these guys who followed him the last year, and then he goes off into the desert to figure some stuff out. And then he goes to Damascus and he doesn't talk to any of these guys. And if you look at the book of Acts and how it domesticates, or however you want to say that, right? It tames his story, and it's all about, this other version. I just think, I don't think he meant the harm that came from it.
This is great. So Paul is, in my best estimation, trying to do what he thinks is right here in a situation where, I mean, I suspect he sees the hypocrisy that's going on in his own time and saying, this isn't, we've got really, really wonderful Gentile people, and we need to assimilate in some way also. It's not only a sociological way in which that it fits really well to make a simple Judaism grabble, let's get along with the guys that we're living next to. And I think he was such a Hellenistic Jew nonetheless, but super Hellenistic that he might be a little flexible in ways others would never be. Wouldn't you think a Jew would have tried to convert them and say, hey, you need to snip your, stuff if you're going to start collabing, unless you're going to remain a God-fearer on the outside and just keep your distance. Now he's making them step their game up. In one way, he's becoming more Jewish by saying, get rid of the other gods. In another way, saying, don't worry about the wiener schnauzer. You can just come as you are.
Yeah. I like, the thought of being a good Jew, but considering his own upbringing potentially much more Hellenized. Of course he knows how to get and wants to get along with Gentiles. I like that. I like what that throws into the framework for me. What if, maybe you've considered this already, but what if we consider that Paul was among the people, I've had, even at the beginning of this series on Anti-Judaism and Acts, like, why was Paul killing followers of Jesus to begin with? Like, why was he doing that, right? I'm like, well, let's think about that. What does it say? That Jesus was criticizing what was going down at the temple, and Paul was offended by it. So Paul's offended by it. Paul is a part of that world. He is in with the people of the temple, right? He has power given to him by the temple. Of course he's threatened by what Jesus says. And so whatever you do with that, and then his realization, what he goes from is, I'm among the people that this Jew was, accusing of being accusing of being exploitative. So I'm threatened by him and his potential followers, to now I'm just doing something totally different. It's a striking shift. It's a shift that the tradition has taught us to see smoothly and seamlessly, but I don't think it's all that smooth and seamless. I think that there's I think there's more to it to make that kind of a shift. I'm really pissed that there's somebody else who's making a big deal of the rich and powerful becoming more rich and more powerful. Like, I'm offended that you're upset by that. To, hey, let's make that God a God, like that guy a God, like that. Here's the thing. I'm just trying to sneak into this, but when I was at Greensboro College, one of my honor students, I won't name her because she might want to be named, but I won't because I haven't asked her permission. But she did write, her honors thesis was doing a DSM-5 reading of Paul. And of course, you got to take that with a grain of salt. Paul isn't doing all the writings of the letters that are his, right? But has a hand in it. And what is described of him is something of a psychotic break.
That I've got a guy who thinks that Paul was literally crazy. Okay, in some sense. I mean, I've actually heard it said about Martin Luther. Martin Luther, the reformer, might have been a little crazy or something, because anyone who had the guts, you got to think, is there really any does he have a filter? Does he not realize, you know, like, yeah, it seems like anyone it's like me walking up, you know, let me walk into the White House with a pistol on my hip. Can you imagine what's wrong with you? Like, are you crazy? So someone like Paul, I don't know. He just speculates that he thinks he might be a little crazy.
It is a speculation, but my point in saying that was to highlight the shift is more radical, I think, than most people stop to consider. And I say,
yeah, you're just saying that in
the
that
honors thesis was interesting. Yeah, I don't need it to be true or any of that, but I think it's interesting fodder, you know, for like, what does that say? And it is also about taking into consideration his anger and the way he lashes out at times in his letters and things like that. But anyway, so why was I making that point?
I wanted to say something about that point that I thought was interesting. Maybe you'll figure out where you left off in your brain on that. If you think about that psychologically, what Paul might be doing is if he was on the side of the people who were doing bad, or part of the team that was in the wrong, and they kill the Jesus, and then they kill Stephen, or if you buy that narrative, even though Dr. Eisenman says that may have been James, the brother of the Lord, that was actually killed instead of Stephen. There's speculation on the narrative there. So regardless, let's just suppose he's guilty. He feels guilt about this.
Yeah.
But he realizes there's no saving grace. He can't save his brothers. He can't get the Jews. He realized how crazy staunch he was.
Okay.
And he says, I'm up against an impossible, immovable mountain of people who are so knuckleheaded, in his view. I can't go to them. In fact, God has a stumbling block. All right, hint, hint. God has blinded them for now. He's got them hard at hearts, Romans 9-11. You know, right now he's got a pause on them till the fullness of the Gentiles comes in.
Right.
Then I think that God's mercy will melt the hearts of these hard-headed knuckleheads. What do you think?
No, I think that's a legitimate way to look at it. Absolutely.
That's like a psychological analysis 2,000 years removed.
Exactly. It's totally inappropriate. But if you want to try to make some sort of cohesive sense of the claims he's making, I think, honestly, that's probably one of the nicer ways to respect the things he wrote, or the things he had hand in writing, and you know, what's been told to us through the book of Acts. I mean, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because, you know, when he went off into the desert, what did he do? He had to search through his scripture. He had to sort through the scriptures to find things to piece together to make sense of this, right? When I was in seminary, one of my favorite professors, Dr. Don Jewell, a Lutheran, good man, just the sweetest, kindest man. You know, he's like, for his dissertation, he worked with Dahl. I can't remember his first name right now, but they spent their time, you know, his advisor, you know, spent his academic career trying to understand why Paul made those particular connections to begin with. We can look at them and say, well, of course, that makes sense. But given how well Paul knew his own scriptures and how he would have studied them and understood them, he was, in a sense, how did he make those initial connections? What made him, you know, make that, what if we do this? What if we take that idea and put it in that? We can make sense of, you know, this whole bringing the nations, the Gentiles, the nations to the table with the rest of the people of the covenant. I'm not sure if I made my point clear there. I got distracted by my sweet little cat. That he, you know, Paul made these connections that we can read as making sense. But how did he make those initially? And it takes some cherry picking. It takes some, it takes some finagling of the scriptures initially.
Right.
And you just see them as making sense.
I think because we've got so much. This has been a wonderful podcast, by the way.
Good.
This is great. You are wonderful.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Last question I have for this show.
Okay.
And before we ask the question, I want everyone to go get her book. Okay. Show her some support. Go to the website. You guys, it's been on the screen right in front of your eyes. You don't need a bright light to let you know. It's right there. You know what I mean? Go check it out. Show her some love. Show her some support. Comment down below some positivity. That's what we're in it for. Our last question will be, Paul says, I am not a liar. I am not a liar. Now, we can do a lot of things with that. We could try and look at it in different ways. We could say, well, people are accusing him of lying because they're just mad at him with his new doctrine. Or you could say, why is he saying that? Is he lying about something? And what is he lying about? Do you have an opinion? Everyone has opinions. It's okay. There's no problem. What's your thoughts?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember which letter that's in. Is that in 1 Corinthians or is that in?
I think a couple different letters he says it.
I think, well, the reason I'm pausing on answering your question is the context matters, right?
Yes.
I think it comes in the midst of the super apostles passage, right? Chapters 10 to 13 of 2 Corinthians, which is that, like he is pissed. Right? And so I think that context matters, that he is so angry that people are not believing him. People are not taking his word as correct. Somebody came along behind him and had a whole new idea, or at least changed it enough, makes him angry. I'm not lying. People are calling him a liar. That's how I read that, is he is just fed up with not being respected or not being the final say. Someone else could actually come along and convince these people otherwise, something like that. But I see, I think he means it in that moment, on that particular topic, on that particular issue. That's how I read that, just to make it clear what I'm trying to say there.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, I see hints in Galatians where he doesn't say, I'm not a liar. He doesn't have to say that, but I get the hint that he's trying to make a case. He's trying to say, look, they approved it. Okay, everything was good.
Totally.
I don't need them anyway. Yeah.
It's not. No, he says a couple times, I did not confer with any human on this. I mean, it's not just a hint, Derek. It is lots of layers of rhetorical. Like, this is legit, people.
This is interesting. It makes me want to ask another one, but I don't want to get too far lost. I interview lots of mythicists. Okay, they are not common in academic realms because, it's kind of a shunned view. It's like a fringe view, which I understand why historians would take a historical Jesus. But there are a lot of people who see Paul's visionary Christ, Paul's illuminating idea, and say the concept of Jesus Christ, even if there was a Jew somehow that may have died, all right, we know that according to them, they're like, that's not, there was no historical guy that they'll say, is ultimately the basis for this. This is more of a mystery school, Hellenistic deity, deity, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that the Gospels are kind of a euhemerist idea of the Christ angelic figure, which they consider Christ to be an angel, sort of like Daniel's son of man, like a son of man. And I had Dr. John J. Collins on recently, Old Testament scholar. He just recently was on, and he was talking about how Daniel's angelic Lord or angelic figure was angelic. And I asked him this, I was like, what about Jesus though? Like, could he have been what if Paul's imaginary, or let's not, I don't mean that disrespectful, his visionary Christ was an angel instead of a man here on earth in recent history? And what they did in the Gospels, they took a historical context in which Jews were killed all the time, things like that, and they narrated a historical fiction of the times. Could it be that this guy didn't actually exist, so to speak, but he was just a template for Jews? And so it's not a bad question to ask. It really isn't, even though I know it's taboo to touch it. But Do you have an opinion?
I think, I don't ever go that place with, in anything I write or when I teach, because I'm trying to get people to make baby steps in reconsidering the way they view what the Bible is. But I think ultimately that's what I think I don't necessarily like go to the mystical visionary place, but
Right.
that serves to talk about putting, that serves as a placeholder
Right.
for the story, for the narrative, for the meaning.
Your way makes sense. I mean, it's what I tell the guys who are on both sides all the time. Both sides can make sense depending on how you want to view the evidence. But like, I wonder if it can be a both and in many ways. And that's why I think historicism, ultimately, the historicist position has stronger balance, because it can be myth and yet be a real basis in reality, real guy, real things. But you got to go all the way to be mythicist. And it's like, if you're wrong, then it could be both. And the archons of this age crucified him. Well, that sounds like the devils, the demons, the deities.
Oh, yeah, but that's the Deutero-Paul saying, right?
Right.
Archons for Paul are the actual, like the government leaders and the humans.
You see how you see that? And that's perfect. I mean, like, but there are people who say that they're purely demons. What if it was spirits that are working in those people?
Right. No, I totally get that too. I do.
I'm just throwing it out there, but
no, it's fine. I relate to it. I remember reading things that way. It kind of taps back into the whole magical, right? The Bible, it's like the whole thing is being orchestrated by God or whatever. Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I think it's an excellent way of getting at what's going on, and so I think I respect the way people are going to read the narrative. They're going to read these things through who they are. It's just the way we do. It's just what we do, right? Can I throw one last thing in?
Anything you want.
Just, I know that you want to wrap up soon, but there was one more thing I wanted to say about the anti-Judaism in Acts bit, because you kept asking and I kept not really well answering.
Okay.
But I did want to leave that. Part of it is there's just lots of things that kind of add up. But one thing that I think is, again, a thing that many people that are either raised in or familiar with the Christian tradition kind of take for granted. And that is that there's a reason why the Christian tradition has been okay embracing Paul, because he became one of us, because he's on our side.
Mm-hmm.
We're okay with embracing this guy who literally, according to the story, had people killed. And he left that. That's why we're okay with it.
Right.
But the people he left are Jews. And so that is the very subconscious message, right? Very, very rhetorically powerful. They were not necessarily super conscious of it. That's why we're so compelled by this conversion story that people today will embrace, and they look to Paul's story as an example for it, right? I was this horrible person and now I'm not because I love Jesus. That's how the story of Acts reads. Paul was the worst person and he was killing the followers of Jesus, and then he became one, and so now we're all fine with it. But we're not stopping to think about what that says then about all the people that Paul used to identify with, who are now essentially Jews.
You just gave me an aha moment. I'm not kidding. I'm serious, because you just made me realize, in light of the Acts and everything you were talking about, because we should have said anti-Judaism in the New Testament, because it is obviously in Acts. Acts is so much in line with what you're saying. But I just thought about what I said earlier with Romans 11, the fullness of the Gentile comes in. Paul's understanding is the Christian understanding, and the Christian understand the way that Christians, what I mean by that today and throughout church history, is that right now it ain't about the Jews anymore. It's about the Gentiles, because the fullness of the Gentiles has not come in. Therefore, all Israel hasn't been saved. And just till recent, like I said earlier, with presidents that want to make prophecy fulfilled, they're fundamentalist Christians. they want to import Jews from across the earth into Israel because they want to make end time prophecy happen and all this. And it's like, look, that's above my pay grade to comment. And I'm apolitical here on this channel as much as possible, but there may be pros, but there are a lot of cons to what has happened. And it's just, the way I'm looking at it is I think that would be a driving force as well. And people would probably have sermons throughout history saying, it ain't about the Jews, it's about the Gentiles right now. So can you imagine subconsciously what that does in a Christian's mind? Not only did he leave the Jews, he saw them as hard-headed knuckleheads,
Exactly.
on and on and on and on
Exactly.
and on.
He calls them that. Yes. Exactly.
And I don't think that that's his original intention at all. I think it was a simple issue.
No, I don't
Like,
think so.
yeah, can you imagine if I left, like, being part of your group or whatever, like, and then later on, somehow like, our color, our skin complexion becomes the primary focus somehow, or whatever it may be. I could see how something spins off and becomes bigger than what it ever originally may have been.
Exactly. And, then you kind of fold into that, all the negative, Paul had a message for the Jews and he says to them in a synagogue, you've rejected it. And that's what opened the door to the Gentiles. So your rejection of the truth is what makes me go and do what I need to do. But you're condemning yourself to not even deserving eternal life. That is said in the God. That's, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to start get worked up all over again. Yeah. I mean, it's in there, planting seeds for sure.
Your energy is contagious, and I love this. I wish I was at your college. I could learn from you. You really bring an exciting, you make everything fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This has been such a fun conversation.
I told you.
Yeah, you did.
I was like, look, I promise I'm not an enemy. I prophesy. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. Now you busted.
You really are awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, go check her works out, please. Her website's on the screen. The book is there. Dr. Jennifer Bird. Do you have anything you'd like to say closing us out?
Thank you. It's been a delightful conversation. I really, truly, I appreciate getting to speak with you.
Ditto.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know how it always ends. And if you forget, we are MythVision. Join our Patreon